spent 15 years as a broadcast journalist, including 6 years as Capitol correspondent for WBRZ. He's a journalism grad from Louisiana Tech, and he's here to talk about the session and some education bills that are pending this year. Please welcome Barry Erwin.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And I won't belabor all of this stuff since we are at the point in the legislature where, kind of one where we haven't ever been before, where the budget's passed and we still got almost 2 weeks left. But I just thought I would give you a couple of observations, maybe starting with the budget a little bit, just quickly, but then about some of the education stuff. And we'll kind of go through this quickly and then see if you have any questions. But it occurred to me when I was kind of looking at things just the last couple of days, this legislature, I'm not talking about this legislative session, but the legislature itself has kind of had some pretty historic things happen during this particular term. I mean, they had the first veto override session that we've ever had, really, at least since the new Constitution last year. They came back this year and actually vetoed the redistricting plan, overrode the veto of the redistricting plan that the governor vetoed. And now they passed the budget in an inordinately record amount of time, just so they could have a veto if they need to. And so obviously the overriding factor here is talking about veto, but I don't know, one thing that just struck me, I always told people everywhere I went that the legislature would always take, every bit of time that it had, would go to the last minute. I mean, back in the days, and Beth and Lanny, you remember these days, Will, you might too, the legislature used to adjourn at midnight, on the night. And so, even though it was midnight, they would still go up to midnight. I mean, it was just whatever you put the time, they figured out if you moved it to 6, well, they'll finish at 6. It wasn't that they needed the time, it's just that they had to go to the last minute. And the budget was usually the overriding driver in a lot of that stuff. Even though, the governor would issue his budget in late January, early February, you had all that time, weeks to prepare and have committee hearings before the session started, which they did. And then you'd have the hearings, during the session. And the truth is, how hard did it take to figure out what you were going to do with the budget? But we had to go to the last minute no matter what. So this year it took a Democratic governor, John Bel Edwards, who was vetoing certain things in the budget, particularly targeting perhaps some legislators and all that they didn't like, for them to figure out that really they could pass a budget in much shorter time than waiting to the last day of the session, the last days of the session. So we'll see if this is something that actually sticks or if it's kind of just a one-time phenomenon. But it's very interesting to see what the legislature can do in terms of timelines and deadlines when properly motivated. You're looking at the budget too. It strikes me that it's interesting. The budget this year, if you're just talking about state general fund, is around $11 billion, which is the largest that we've ever had. It's not really that far out of line from what it was, back right in the Katrina era, but it's shown how flat the budget growth that we've had over the years has actually been until just right about now. I mean, if you really look at where we were before the revenue estimating conference met and all that, we were still at about $9.6 billion going into this session in terms of state general fund, when we were at about 10.1 or 10.4 billion back in 2007, 2008. So we've had a pretty flat general fund budget for well over a decade, and this is really the first growth that we've ever really had. I think the challenge is going to be having to figure out how to ratchet that back up in a couple of years in 2026, when we see a bunch of money that's in the state general fund right now going off the books, either through the temporary sales tax that we're going to have going off the books in 2025, and also the vehicle sales tax money that's going to be partially reverted to the transportation trust fund that we're coming over a couple of years. So that will be the challenge that they face at the time, but that's something that I guess they have a little time to fool around with, and they'll figure that out. But the other thing that strikes me about where we are right now money-wise is that, not because COVID's certainly been a good thing, but if you think about it, without COVID, it makes you wonder how we could have done some things that we are doing in the budget both last year and this year and maybe even going into next year that are huge big-ticket items that really we had no way of trying to fund those or do anything about those. Had the dollars that we had, and some of these are state revenues obviously, but a lot of federal revenues as well, if those things did not come into play. I mean, number one, and we've talked about it the most, are the transportation projects. And certainly we have had the ability to take a lot of dollars and put them into transportation projects that have been talked about for whatever. The bridge here, of course, I-49 north-south, Calcasieu Bridge, all of those types of things. We've been talking about those for years and years and years. Certainly we don't have enough money to fund those, but we finally have some money that was kind of dropped out of nowhere that we can put towards these projects that we wouldn't have had if we had not been in this situation. The other thing that strikes me, and this is one of those things that was sort of one of those ticking time bombs that we kind of knew about, but probably not that well known among the people in the general public, was about the issues with water systems and sewage systems in so many of these municipalities and communities across the state. I mean, again, we're talking about billions of dollars and really huge public safety issues that we knew were kind of out there. But really, if you think about it, if these revenues hadn't come in, where would we have possibly gotten, the revenue, especially in the kind of trends we are about flat spending and that type of thing, to really invest in those things over any period of time? Now, the money we have probably isn't enough to solve every one of those problems, and we still have some administrative issues, I would say, to work out of how we're going to really make that work. But we have opportunities to help in those communities, which are really huge parts of our state, even though they're small communities, with ways which we would never have had before. And on top of that, I would say, until a couple of years ago, who knew that we had such a debt that we owed to the federal government for the levees in New Orleans? I mean, just 3 or whatever years ago, I don't think anybody in the legislature, outside of maybe one or two or a handful of people, knew that we had such a huge amount of debt that we owed to the federal government and how much that was going to have to pay if we didn't pay up. Without these dollars, it's kind of hard to imagine where we would have come up with those, especially, given kind of, again, our sense about reducing taxes and having a lot of temporary taxes. And then on top of that, the hurricane funds that we still owe to FEMA because of past hurricanes going back to Katrina, another huge, huge sum of money. So if nothing else, one thing that's happened because of the largesse that has come to the state, I guess, because of COVID or whatever reasons, we have got money to pay off some huge debts and some huge expenses and huge things that we really needed to take care of, that it's just hard to see where we would have come up with them before. So, I mean, if we don't think of COVID as a positive thing by any sense, it certainly had a huge impact on all of us individually, on our health, on our people, our friends, our family that we've lost, but it certainly made a difference in our state in terms of the dollars that are available for us to address needs that we probably wouldn't have had before. Switching briefly to education, I'll kind of stick with the budget theme. Really, if you look at it from an education point of view, the biggest impact I think this session has been in terms of the budget, in terms of funding that's been available. Just really quickly, I'll go to early childhood education. Right now, there's about $83 million that's going to early childhood. Probably about half of that is one-time money. The other is recurring. But if you put that together, that's still one of the largest amounts, or probably the largest amount that our state has ever put towards early childhood education, really in the years that we've been talking about it. It's not enough. We're going to have to figure out how we're going to be able to duplicate this or build on this in some way in the future. But certainly, it's a good step. And I would hope that by legislators putting that amount of money towards early childhood, it's kind of a statement from them that they believe that it is important after all, that it should be a priority. And as we come into the next year and the next year after that, it will still be kind of a high on the mind, high on the list of things that we need to kind of make our investments in. In terms of K-12 education, the MFP kind of really drives that. Student count really drives that. So we hadn't increased the MFP per se in any way in terms of that funding for students, whatever. But there is the teacher pay raise that's in there, and it's about $1,500 for teachers. I'd say from CABL's point of view, we're disappointed, as others are, that it couldn't be bumped up to the $2,000. I mean, people rightly point out what's happened in Mississippi, where they've had a $5,000 pay increase, albeit I will say their teacher pay in Mississippi is lower than ours, and their $5,000 will probably put them close to where we are, but they were pretty much last in the country, so they had some ground to make up. But in Alabama, they did the same thing in a way with pay raises that kind of worked on a different scale. They were percentage, like for certain ones, a minimum of 4%, but pay raises for veteran teachers up to almost 30%, large amounts of money. So both of those states kind of made generational increases in teacher pay during this period of time. We haven't done so much. We've been doing incremental change. I mean, certainly any change is positive, but I will tell you, as one who serves on task force that's looking at teacher recruitment and retention, we've got to do a lot of things to try and solve that problem. With the loss of teachers we've had over the last few years, COVID has exacerbated that, but it's not the only problem. And there are a lot of things that we're looking at that we probably need to do to try and increase retention and also recruitment. But one has to consider that compensation has certainly got to be a part of that. And somehow we need to kind of work that into the equation going forward, although it would seem to be a challenge for us to figure out how we're going to do that more in the future when we've got these kind of revenue sources from the state general fund that are going to be moving away or disappearing in some cases, or moving away into other things if we don't do something else. Higher ed, this was probably a hugest year in terms of higher ed funding, I guess probably in well more than a decade, more than $100 million. Some of that is going to faculty pay, some of it's going to operational things, some of it in other places is going towards deferred maintenance, which tends to be things that pile up on these college campuses where every time they get a budget cut, we just defer fixing something. So instead of fixing the roof that needs to be fixed, we patch the roof that needs to be fixed, and then it needs to be fixed again, and we drag this on. The backlog there is huge, and this won't begin to cover some of those costs, but it will, I guess, be a down payment on some of the things that need to be done there. And I think the other thing I'd say on higher ed, we were very pleased that I think it's probably the third year or so, if not in a row, at least in recent years, that more money has been put towards Go grants, which are, of course, our needs-based financial aid for students in Louisiana. One thing that happened, as you probably know, during all of the budget cuts of the Jindal years, we cut higher education drastically, but we raised tuition, drastically as well. And so by doing that, we kind of kept our institutions alive and functioning, but at the same time, we really added to the cost for students to get post-secondary education, which is, of course, a big problem in Louisiana for two fronts. One, we have amongst the lowest educational attainment of our citizenry, our adult population in the entire country. And two, we have a poor population that needs financial assistance to try and help, get access to higher education in whatever way that we can. We spend well over $300 million on TOPS. I think we're spending probably 45 to maybe close to 50 million on these Go grants. It's a big difference still, but I think it's at least something that's really important, that we continue to add that to the pot so that we can expand access, especially when we have a goal in our state that the Board of Regents has set of having 60% of our adult population with some kind of credential, post-secondary credential of value. So I think that's a good thing for higher ed. When it comes to legislation itself, I think the kind of sleeper issue or whatever it was that maybe people didn't see coming, but it's actually become an interesting issue for this session, is the concept of education savings accounts. And I'm not sure if you're totally familiar with what they are, but I guess you could kind of compare them in some ways to vouchers. Vouchers are really just kind of a way for the state to help fund private school education for a limited group of families in our state, and we do that with a kind of small scholarship program, as we call it, that's a voucher program. The education savings accounts are a little different concept, but it kind of takes some of the same approach as vouchers do. What it really does, for those of you who haven't really heard about it, is it sort of creates what they call a education savings account for families who already have their kids in public schools, to allow them to access the dollars that would have gone from the MFP, theoretically, to the public school, to go to the parents into that savings account for them to use to educate their kids in another way if they choose to. Now, the obvious way is probably to put a child in a private school, but it could be a homeschooling variation where you had tutoring and you had other folks coming in doing different things. So in Louisiana, we've kind of got 4 bills that are still in the process of doing things. They each kind of look at a limited population of students, but they are targeted in those ways. One of them has to do with foster kids or kids who are in foster families or military families, or if they live in or go to schools that are D or F schools, but they haven't been able to transfer to another school of a higher grade level. It's got an ESA, an education savings account opportunity, if it passes, for those kids. Another one is for kids who are victims of bullying. They're in a school where they're being bullied. They want an opportunity to go somewhere else. This would create an education savings account where they would have that opportunity. Another one is for kids in the early grades that are having literacy problems in second and third grade. Same thing, education savings account to give them an opportunity to go somewhere else. And the last one is for special needs students, disabilities or whatever, for them to also have those opportunities as well. In the big picture, I mean, people, kind of say the sky is falling. It's going to be the demise of public education if these things pass. I think in realistic terms, we're talking about 4 groups of kind of targeted kids that probably, in the scheme of things, are not that huge amount that would end up, A, taking advantage of it on their own because of their own volition, or 2, because of capacity issues, where they would go, opportunities, or the kind of infrastructure, if you want to call it that, that's out there for other opportunities. But I do think they're kind of an important step forward for us to at least try and see how they work. We can see if, after a couple of years, if some of these kids who have run into one of these things or fit into one of these special circumstances, do they take advantage of it or not? Do they have places to go? Do they have the options available to them if they have the dollars that are available for them to access other things? We don't really know the answer to that question right now, but I think it'll be interesting for us to see as we go forward if those things are meaningful or if they're just something that may pass by the wayside, as we go forward. But I think you've got all 4 of those bills moving. Every one of them has passed one chamber of the legislature. One of them is over on the House side that came from the Senate. You got 3 others that are in the Senate. I think maybe later this week we'll get a better idea of how those bills do. I think there's a good chance that at least 1 or 2 of those bills might pass. Maybe all 4. I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. It's hard to read the tea leaves on that right now, especially with the bills on the Senate side. But we'll see. But I think that's going to be an interesting thing in terms of the education front for us to take a look at over the next couple of years. And finally, I'll just kind of close on talking about bills that are kind of helpful, I think, that are not maybe huge things, but we're working to do some things again to expand dual enrollment opportunities. I think that's a very positive thing. We're doing some things in our college campuses to try and enhance opportunities for students to transfer from one school to another, from a 4-year school to a 2-year school within higher education, to make sure that not only those credits transfer, but the credits transfer towards the career and the diplomas that those students are seeking. It does seem kind of weird that after all these years with our community and technical college system in place, we still have some of those articulation issues, but it's not surprising on the other hand if you really stop and think about it. But I think the good news is we are taking some steps, hopefully, that will try and address that issue, make it easier for our kids wherever they're going in post-secondary education, transfer and to move back and forth wherever they need to, for the benefit of them, but also for our state and for our workforce. So that's just kind of an overview of things. I think overall there's a possibility for this to be a good session for education. I know nobody looked at this as being an education session going into it, but by my count, there were more than 170 bills introduced on education this session, which is more than 10% of the original number that were introduced. A lot of those, are not very big. Some of them thankfully did not pass. Some of them thankfully got killed in the process. Others will just kind of fall by the wayside. But at the end of the day, I think there are some really good opportunity for this year to be a positive year for education, really at all levels. And so we're keeping our fingers crossed as we come towards the end of that will in fact be the case. So with that, I'll just kind of wrap it up and see if you have any questions or comments or thoughts about any of those things.
Erwin, the teacher pay raise, the governor's always said that he intended to reach the SREP average by the time he leaves office. Do you think he can justifiably say that the pandemic derailed that, or do you think that there's other things that work that make it look like this is not going to happen?
Well, I don't know that I would say that the pandemic per se derailed that. I mean, honestly, if you look at what the pandemic did, it caused a downturn in our economy, or certainly a projected downturn in our economy. And the REC, the Revenue Estimating Conference, made very, very, very conservative estimates about what our revenues are going to be. What we found out afterwards is those were very, very conservative, and we had to build things back. Now, a lot of that was one-time money, but a lot of that was also, you know, not surplus dollars, but recurring dollars that were out there. It's hard for me to say that the pandemic itself would be a reason that we could not raise teacher pay further than we did. I'm not sure that we would have ever gotten to the Southern Regional average either way, because we tend to do it in incremental ways, and we've still got a little ways to go. But it's hard for me to say that the pandemic itself prevented us from raising teacher salaries to a higher level than we've been able to do that. $800 a year last year was not that much. The $1,500 a year this year is not that much. We've still got a ways to go, and we're still near the very bottom in the entire country. And again, looking at the retention and recruitment issues that we are dealing with in our state, and the kind of massive hemorrhage, loss of teachers that we've seen because of the pandemic, and I'll say that's been a part of it. It's hard not to say that compensation has got to be a part of the equation, both in the short term and the long term, and how we address that and getting more teachers into our classrooms. And I will say this, when Alabama raised their teacher pay earlier this year to a pretty substantial amount, one of the things that you heard coming out of Alabama was that that had teachers themselves who were very close to retiring and talking about retiring, talking about staying in the classroom instead. And so if we get more people, we're having to do the opposite. We're having to go to retired teachers and try and say, okay, you're retired, we're trying to get you back in the classroom. If we can do things with teacher compensation that help keep our teachers in the classroom longer than they would otherwise, that's only a positive. And if we can do the same thing on the front end by boosting those salaries for recruitment purposes, I think that would be a positive too. Ben.
Barry, what about the petty personal politics that transfer litter money to wildlife and fisheries from Illinois?
Honestly, I don't know as much about that particular part of it, but you talk about petty politics. We're seeing quite a bit of it in different ways. I mean, not all of it is stuff passing, but I tell you, when you look at things, you do see some very political things. I mean, one, at least when you're talking about bills that were introduced, you saw legislation to take the governor's appointments to Bessie away. You saw legislation to move Department of Economic Development, LED, into the Lieutenant Governor's office. You're seeing a bill that looks like it may be moving to take the Capitol grounds away from the Division of Administration and put that in the Lieutenant Governor's office. You know, you just have to wonder what people are doing with different kind of things that are kind of targeting the governor in one way or the other, and certainly doing things to benefit the Lieutenant Governor's office. So, not all of those things are going to pass, but I think it's not unusual to see bits, tit for tat in terms of things. And the other thing, I mean, I don't think I'm saying this out of school or whatever compared to what others have said and a lot of people have acknowledged. The relationship between the legislature and the governor is not particularly good, and I'd say that's particularly true on the House side, which is where you see some of this legislation. And I'm not blaming one thing or any piece of legislation on one thing or another, but I do think that there is, more difficult blood there, bad blood there, than there has been in any time really, probably in this term. And I think you're seeing some of that come through in terms of some of the legislation that has been proposed and looks like a little bit of tit for tat on things, which is another reason why I think you're seeing the passage of the budget so early and, trying to get past the threat of line item vetoes. So, of course, Beth, you and I have been around. This is nothing new in state politics to have a lot of petty politics going on.
Especially in the lame duck.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of that is just posturing for the next race, right?
It is. I think a lot of it is posturing. And then the other question really is, when you see the legislature kind of doing some of the things it's done, where it says, look, we need to make the veto session not be just something that's extraordinary, but the norm. We need to be passing the budget early, not just as something extraordinary, but the norm. So the question that it begs is that really the case when you have next year or next time when we have probably a Republican governor, probably a different kind of philosophy in there? Is the legislature going to keep this newfound, independence that they've always been talking about ever since I've been around? Or are they going to go back to the way that they used to be, following what the governor said? So we'll see how much of this last kind of 8 years has been sort of an anomaly in terms of that. Or is the legislature really, creating some level of independence that they've been talking about for decades and decades and decades, and that will stand not just because the governor is a Democrat, but because the governor may be of the same party as the majority of the legislature. I think that's going to be interesting to see.
Speaking of things that we talked about over and over, is there shift money from nursing homes to home health care?
And I don't know, honestly, I'm not sure where that is right now. Maybe somebody else could answer that question. Obviously, our group and others have always been, of the position that, we need to be providing care closest to the community, closest to having the money follow the individual to a setting that is the, least restrictive and that type of thing. But honestly, I'll tell you, we've been so much involved in the education stuff in other parts. I don't know where that part of it is with the nursing homes and the community care. Nowhere.
Barry, we've seen a number of bills. The Nelson bill on saying that third graders shouldn't be advanced and fail the reading test. We've seen a Hewitt bill about changing the COPS requirements. And is there a sense that the legislature is passing education bills without a sense of context or in association with Bessie and the governor and the system, basically?
You're asking about whether the legislature is perhaps passing some things that deal with significant policies, kind of maybe with outside of the context of Bessie or other things. Ad hoc. I would say that's always a danger, but I do think that's happening to some degree here. And I'm not here to pick on anybody's bills or whatever, but I'll just kind of point out, for instance, on the bill talking about whether to pass kids from third grade to fourth grade, hold them back like they do in Mississippi if they're not at grade level. From a just kind of top of my head point of view, if I'm a regular person, that seems to make sense, right? Because, if you're not reading by third grade and you're going into fourth grade and you're not where you need to be, you're probably going to have an issue for the rest of your life. Because as we always talk about, you learn to read through third grade. By the time you're in fourth grade, that's where you read to learn. So that's kind of the line that we use. And Mississippi's done that, and their scores have really gone up. The problem is there's not all the context of what we see in Mississippi. In Mississippi, they do have that provision where they hold those kids back. They've also invested a boatload of money into some things to really improve early literacy and also change the way their teachers teach reading in those early grades. They did it a few years ago, and it's had really quick returns. And so we have done some of that ourselves. We passed some legislation last year. We're trying to beef some of that up this year, where we hope to do some of those same things. But the issue, to your point on that, one of the things you've also heard is that maybe just taking a child and not passing them to fourth grade and leaving them in third grade to repeat over again is not the solution to making them read, because they didn't learn to read when they were in third grade. So why repeating the same grade again is going to get them up to speed? Kind of begs the question, how's that going to happen? They probably needed to go back earlier, in a much earlier grade, and start at those more foundational levels. I'll give you another example really quickly. You remember the bill that came up in the committee the other day having to do with lowering the standards for TOPS Tech so that we could get kids, more eligible for TOPS Tech. That would be a substantial change in that program, done on the fly without a lot of debate or input. Well, it was amended in the committee to take it away from that, but it was amended to change the M.J. Foster Promise program that we have for kids going to community, actually it's not kids, it's adults in community colleges, to really turn that program upside down from what it was intended before it even is implemented. So to your point, those are things where the legislature is, in fact, it seems to me, trying to respond to things that are real issues, things they're trying to deal with, but maybe doing it outside of the context where it really has to do with policy. We kind of make fun of this idea of having study groups, because every time, we do something, we can't pass something, we say, oh, let's have a study group. That's how we kill a bill. The truth is, some of these study groups are really important. And I would say on that bill dealing with the TOPS Tech and those kids trying to get, better access to community colleges, that's something where we probably do need to study some of these things. We have a ton of money that's available right now for training in a variety of programs. Making a big change in a program that we just passed, a year ago and haven't even implemented doesn't seem to make sense. So to your point, I think that's something we always have to watch out for, where people have good intentions. They want to do things in the education front. They see what some other states are doing, or they come up with an idea and they say, oh, that makes sense to me. But we really need to have a bigger discussion and look at the ramifications, the unintended consequences, and whether we're really making the right decision for our kids. And I will say, in a number of cases we've killed some of those bills, but in some cases some of them are still moving.
With the education bills that you mentioned earlier, you said they have a similar goal to voucher programs. Do any of these proposals have the potential to have the same problems that the voucher program has? There's constitutional issues where it's challenged whether it's okay to use the this. There was also maybe the quality of some of the instruction limited to vouchers, which was not what people would hope for. Potential for similar problems on these proposals.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, questions about whether some of the issues that have come up with vouchers could come up with these education savings accounts. First of all, I think the constitutional issue is the same kind of thing. I think they'll have to figure that out, and if somebody challenges that, that's just an issue that will have to kind of come up and play itself out. The other part is, I will say this, the legislation itself is, not very totally specific in terms of the accountability piece of it. What it does do, however, is give Bessie the authority, or recognizes Bessie has the authority to do that accountability piece. So I think that would have to come in step 2. Now, we'll say this, Bessie and, well, the Department of Ed can't really do it, but Bessie leadership has endorsed the education savings accounts concept. They have kind of put their stamp of approval on that. What that says to me is that they're interested in that as a tool to help kids in these limited circumstances, but that they also hopefully would be serious about providing the accountability component to that, to make sure that if it's not working for those kids, that again there's the ability to change that, or to disapprove the schools or whatever it might be that are participating in the program. Bessie does have the authority through this legislation to approve, any school that's participating, any vendors, all of those type of things, similar to what we do now in other programs like course choice and things like that. So they have authority to approve vendors. To me, implied in that is the authority to take that away. So we need to see that more explicitly drawn out when, assuming some of these pass, that Bessie gets it. So my hope is that there definitely is some accountability that's there, because the last thing we want is for our kids to go from one setting to another and not get the improvement and the benefits that we hope will accrue to them.
Barry, I've been very impressed with your presentation, but more importantly, I'm curious. I'm thinking back a couple of years, and one of the major issues during the legislative process was issues dealing with energy, or energy in general. I know we're going through a transition, and I'm just trying to get your input because you're there. I haven't gone to the legislature this year. I've lost a little hair because of that. But anyway, is there anything going on in that aspect as far as, especially because the governor came up with his with the climate action process, and there's things going on with the green hydrogen thing. And I'm just curious what's going on, because at one time, this was a major play at the legislature, and I hadn't, and again, I was looking from the outside, and I didn't see anything that drove me to go down to the legislature and embarrass myself and to address some of these questions. Have any of this issue been raised?
I think I'm not totally on top of this, I'll just be honest with you. I think there has been some attempt in some parts of the legislature, particularly some regions of the state, to try and do things to help encourage things like wind farms and those types of things in the Gulf. But there's been the opposite reaction too, and I think if I just kind of looked at the bills that were filed this session, I would say that a lot of them had to do with kind of sticking your head in the ground, because we saw things to totally get rid of severance taxes on oil and gas things. We saw things to not allow solar farms to be part of the ITEP program, which you can argue whether they should or not be, whatever, but it seemed to me that was a message that we are not embracing other forms of alternative energy solutions. So if you kind of look at what was passed, I think you see some things that look like we're still stuck in the past. When you look at, let me say that again. When you look at bills that were introduced, and that were, debated during the session. It looks like we're kind of sticking our head in the past and trying to, hold on to the last vestiges of what we have. On the other hand, I will say, none of those bills are really going to pass, and that's a good thing. And so hopefully, we're beginning to look more forward. I do think LED as an agency is looking more and more and working with groups to try and promote the alternative sources of energy. So I think in the bigger picture, we're probably positioning ourselves a little bit better than we are in the legislature. I don't think the legislature is the pulse to take for where we're really going in terms of moving forward to alternative energy and thinking about our future as an energy state, but as a different kind of energy state. But fingers crossed that we do the right thing on that.
Transition.
I think it's time for you to roll here. Well, thanks very much, and appreciate y'all coming, and look forward to the final days of the legislative session.
Sure, but it's very